He stood off to the side, forgotten. Just an old relic, they said. First Sergeant Robert Morrison had been relegated to the sidelines of the police academy's tactical training exercise, his 62-year-old frame leaning against a concrete wall as 30 young recruits stumbled through what should have been a basic formation drill. To the academy instructors and fresh-faced cadets, he was just another aging veteran taking up space in their modern law enforcement program, a relic from the military who couldn't adapt to civilian policing methods. The recruits whispered jokes about the old man who still wore his boots spit-shined and his uniform pressed with military precision, who said "Roger" instead of "copy," and insisted on addressing everyone by their proper rank or title. They saw him as a dinosaur clinging to outdated military protocols in an age of community policing and de-escalation techniques. But when the squad broke formation during a high-stress scenario, when panic began rising and the young recruits started to scatter in confusion while their instructor struggled to maintain control, everything changed in an instant. Morrison pushed himself off the wall and barked 3 words that cut through the chaos like a blade. "Police your ranks." The entire line snapped back into perfect order immediately, 30 confused recruits suddenly moving with precision and purpose as decades of command presence took control of the situation. In that moment, they didn't see a relic from another era. They saw their leader, someone whose authority transcended age and circumstances, whose voice carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had commanded respect in the most dangerous situations imaginable. Welcome to the Silent Salute. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. Your support means everything to us, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button. We're growing every day, and every single one of you makes that possible. Thank you for being part of our community. The Metro Police Academy in Denver, Colorado, was conducting its most intensive training cycle of the year, preparing 30 recruits for careers in law enforcement through 16 weeks of classroom instruction, physical conditioning, and tactical scenarios. The academy prided itself on using the latest training methodologies and modern approaches to policing that emphasize community engagement, crisis intervention, and de-escalation techniques. First Sergeant Robert Morrison had enrolled in the academy at age 62, one of the oldest recruits in the program's history. After serving 30 years in the Army, including multiple combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, Morrison had decided to pursue a second career in law enforcement, drawn by a desire to continue serving his community in a meaningful way. Morrison's military background was extensive and distinguished. He had enlisted as an 18-year-old infantry private and worked his way up through the ranks to become a first sergeant, the senior enlisted leader responsible for the welfare and discipline of an entire company. He had earned the Combat Infantryman Badge, 3 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart during deployments that had taken him to some of the most dangerous places on Earth. But his military experience, rather than being seen as an asset, had become a source of friction with academy instructors who viewed his background as potentially problematic for modern policing. Captain Sarah Williams, the academy's training director, had expressed concerns about Morrison's ability to adapt from military command structures to civilian law enforcement approaches. Military and police work required different mindsets, Williams had explained to her staff. Soldiers are trained to defeat enemies, but police officers need to serve and protect citizens. We need to make sure that Morrison can make that transition successfully. The other recruits in Morrison's class were mostly in their 20s and 30s, recent college graduates or career changers who brought energy and modern perspectives to their law enforcement training. They had grown up with social media, diversity training, and collaborative leadership styles that emphasized consensus building over authoritarian command. To them, Morrison represented an outdated approach to authority and control that seemed inconsistent with contemporary law enforcement values. They respected his military service in abstract terms, but they questioned whether his command and control background would translate effectively to community policing and citizen interaction. Recruit Officer Jennifer Martinez, a 24-year-old criminal justice graduate, had been particularly vocal about her concerns regarding Morrison's influence on the class. First Sergeant Morrison is obviously a dedicated person, she had told her fellow recruits, but his military approach doesn't fit with what we're learning about modern policing. We need to be community partners, not occupying forces. The sentiment was shared by many of Morrison's classmates, who saw his rigid military bearing and formal communication style as evidence that he couldn't adapt to the more flexible and relationship-focused approach that contemporary law enforcement required. Instructor Detective Mike Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of the Denver Police Department, had been assigned to evaluate Morrison's progress and determine whether his military background was helping or hindering his development as a police officer. Rodriguez's initial assessments had been mixed, noting Morrison's exceptional physical fitness and disciplinary standards while expressing concerns about his interpersonal communication style. Morrison knows how to follow orders and maintain standards, Rodriguez had written in an early evaluation. But police work requires more flexibility and improvisation than military operations. He needs to learn to adapt his leadership style to civilian situations that don't have clear command structures. The training exercise that would change everyone's perspective was designed to simulate a high-stress crowd control situation that police officers might encounter during civil unrest or large public gatherings. The scenario involved 30 recruits working together to establish and maintain security perimeters while managing simulated civilian interactions that could rapidly escalate or de-escalate, depending on their responses. Morrison had been assigned a peripheral role in the exercise, tasked with observing and taking notes rather than participating in the active elements of the scenario. His positioning reflected the instructor's belief that his military background might lead him to approach the situation with excessive force or inappropriate tactics. The exercise began at 1,400 hours with the recruits forming into squads and moving to establish their assigned positions around the training facility. The scenario called for them to maintain crowd control barriers while responding to increasingly aggressive behavior from role-playing actors who were simulating angry protesters. Initially, the exercise proceeded according to plan, with the recruits demonstrating the de-escalation techniques and communication skills they had learned in their classroom training. They spoke politely to the simulated civilians, maintained appropriate distances, and avoided actions that might provoke confrontation. But as the scenario intensified and the role-playing actors became more aggressive and confrontational, the young recruits began to show signs of stress and confusion. The carefully rehearsed techniques they had practiced in controlled environments proved more difficult to implement when faced with realistic pressure and unpredictable civilian behavior. "Get back. You need to move away from the barrier." Recruit Officer Thompson called out to one of the actors, his voice showing strain as he tried to maintain authority while avoiding escalation. "Why should I listen to you?" The actor responded, stepping closer and raising his voice. "This is a public street. You can't tell me where I can and can't stand." Thompson looked around nervously, seeking guidance from his fellow recruits who were dealing with their own confrontations. The formation that had started the exercise in perfect order was beginning to show gaps, as individual officers became focused on their immediate situations rather than maintaining overall tactical awareness. The situation deteriorated rapidly as more actors joined the confrontations, creating multiple pressure points that overwhelmed the recruits' ability to coordinate their responses. What had been a controlled training scenario was becoming a chaotic situation that was spiraling beyond the young officer's ability to manage effectively. "I need backup over here," Martinez called out as she found herself surrounded by 3 aggressive actors who were testing her resolve and challenging her authority. These people won't comply with lawful orders. But the other recruits were dealing with their own problems and couldn't provide immediate assistance. The coordinated response that the exercise was designed to test was breaking down as individual officers became isolated and overwhelmed by the pressure of multiple simultaneous confrontations. Detective Rodriguez was taking notes on the developing problems, but he was allowing the scenario to continue in order to see how the recruits would handle adversity and adapt to changing circumstances. The exercise was designed to be challenging, and some level of confusion and stress was expected as part of the learning process. But when one of the actors suddenly rushed the security line and broke through the barrier, panic began to spread through the ranks of young recruits. The carefully maintained formation collapsed as officers instinctively moved to address the breach, leaving gaps in their perimeter that other actors immediately exploited. "Hold the line. Hold the line," Rodriguez called out, But his instructions were lost in the noise and confusion as 30 recruits tried to respond to multiple threats simultaneously without coordination or clear leadership. That's when Morrison pushed himself off the wall where he had been observing and stepped into the chaos. "Police your ranks." The 3 words exploded across the training area with such authority and unmistakable command presence that every recruit immediately stopped what they were doing and looked toward Morrison. Even the role-playing actors paused their aggressive behavior, instinctively responding to a voice that carried decades of experience in controlling dangerous situations. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The scattered recruits began moving back toward their assigned positions without conscious thought, their bodies responding to the tone of absolute authority that Morrison's voice carried. Within seconds, the broken formation was reforming as 30 young officers remembered their training and their mission. "First rank, dress and cover," Morrison called out, using military terminology that somehow translated perfectly to the law enforcement situation. "Maintain your intervals and watch your sectors." The recruits moved with precision that surprised even their instructors, establishing overlapping fields of observation and creating the coordinated response that had been missing throughout the early phases of the exercise. Morrison's commands had not only restored order, but had elevated their performance to a level they hadn't achieved during weeks of previous training. "Second rank, establish overwatch positions," Morrison continued, his voice calm and controlled despite the chaos that had preceded his intervention. "Maintain communication with your partners and report any changes in crowd behavior." Detective Rodriguez watched in amazement as the same recruits who had been overwhelmed and confused just minutes earlier now moved with confidence and purpose under Morrison's guidance. The exercise that had been spiraling toward failure was now proceeding with textbook precision. But Morrison's real contribution wasn't just tactical. It was his ability to restore confidence and clarity to young officers who had been paralyzed by the complexity of their situation. His commands weren't just about positioning and procedures. They were about giving the recruits a framework for thinking clearly under pressure. "Remember your training," Morrison called out as the actors resumed their aggressive behavior. "You have the authority and the responsibility to maintain order. Use your voice, use your presence, but use them with confidence." Under Morrison's guidance, the recruits began applying their classroom training with newfound effectiveness. The de-escalation techniques that had seemed inadequate during the chaos now worked smoothly when employed by officers who projected confidence and authority rather than uncertainty and fear. "Sir, please step back behind the barrier," Martinez said to one of the aggressive actors, her voice now carrying the kind of polite but unmistakable authority that Morrison had demonstrated. "We're here to ensure everyone's safety, but that requires your cooperation." The difference in her tone and demeanor was remarkable. She was using the same words and techniques she had learned in training, but now she was delivering them with the confidence and presence that came from feeling supported by competent leadership. Thompson, who had been struggling with his confrontation earlier, now addressed his situation with similar effectiveness. "I understand your concerns, but this area has been designated as a security zone for public safety reasons. I need you to move to the designated public area where you can continue your demonstration safely." The exercise continued for another 20 minutes under Morrison's guidance, with the recruits demonstrating levels of coordination and professional competence that exceeded anything they had achieved during previous training scenarios. When the exercise concluded, the contrast between their initial performance and their final capabilities was unmistakable. The after-action review was conducted by Captain Williams, but it was clear that Morrison's intervention had transformed the entire exercise from a potential learning disaster into a demonstration of exceptional police work. The recruits who had been struggling with complex scenarios were now able to discuss their experiences with confidence and understanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams began, addressing the assembled recruits, "what you experienced today was a master class in leadership under pressure. First Sergeant Morrison didn't just solve the problems you were facing. He showed you how to solve them yourselves." She gestured toward Morrison, who was standing quietly at the edge of the group. "What you witnessed was the kind of command presence that comes from decades of leading people in life-and-death situations. More importantly, you learned how that presence can be applied to law enforcement in ways that enhance rather than compromise community policing principles." Martinez, who had been among Morrison's most vocal critics, stepped forward to address the group. "I owe First Sergeant Morrison an apology," she said, her voice showing obvious respect and humility. "I thought his military background would make him too rigid for police work, but what I saw today was exactly the kind of leadership that police officers need." She looked directly at Morrison. "First Sergeant, you didn't use force or intimidation to control that situation. You used presence and confidence to help all of us remember what we were capable of. That's exactly what community policing should look like, strength used in service of others." Thompson added his own perspective on Morrison's intervention. "First Sergeant, when you took command of that situation, you didn't just restore order, you restored our confidence in ourselves. The way you projected authority while still treating everyone with respect showed me what real police leadership looks like." One by one, the other recruits shared their observations about Morrison's performance and what they had learned from watching him work. The consensus was unanimous. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a demonstration of leadership that transcended military and civilian distinctions to reveal universal principles that would serve them throughout their law enforcement careers. Detective Rodriguez, who had been evaluating Morrison's progress throughout the academy, was particularly struck by what he had observed. "First Sergeant, I've been wondering whether your military experience would translate to police work. After today, I don't have any doubts. What you demonstrated was leadership in its purest form, the ability to bring out the best in others under pressure." Morrison's response to the praise was characteristically modest and focused on the development of the young recruits. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you accomplished today was your success, not mine. I just helped you remember what you already knew and apply it when it mattered most." He paused, looking around at the faces of recruits who were hanging on his every word. "The techniques you learned in your training are sound. The principles of community policing you've studied are valid. What you needed today was confidence in your abilities and experience in applying your knowledge under stress." Morrison continued, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of military leadership. "Police work isn't that different from military service when you understand that both are about serving others. The mission changes, the techniques change, but the fundamental requirement to protect people and maintain order remains the same." The formal recognition of Morrison's contribution came in the form of a commendation from the Academy director that specifically noted his role in transforming the exercise and mentoring his fellow recruits. But the real recognition came from the transformation in how he was viewed by the instructors and students who had previously dismissed him as unsuited for modern police work. Within days of the exercise, Morrison found himself being sought out by recruits who wanted additional guidance and mentoring. His outdated military methods were suddenly being studied and adapted by the same people who had previously questioned their relevance to law enforcement. Captain Williams requested that Morrison develop a series of leadership training modules that would incorporate his command experience into the Academy's curriculum. Detective Rodriguez recommended Morrison for assignment to the training division after graduation, recognizing that his unique combination of military leadership and law enforcement training made him valuable for developing future officers. Most importantly, the recruits who had participated in the exercise began applying the lessons they had learned from Morrison to their subsequent training scenarios and practical exercises. The confidence and clarity that he had demonstrated became a model for how they approached challenging situations and supported their fellow officers. 6 months after graduation, Morrison's influence on his academy class was unmistakable. The officers who had learned from his example were performing at levels that exceeded expectations, earning recognition for their professionalism, their ability to handle high-stress situations, and their skill at building community relationships while maintaining authority. When Morrison completed his probationary period and was sworn in as a full police officer, the ceremony included many of the recruits whose careers had been influenced by his mentorship and example. The speakers included academy instructors, field training officers, and community leaders who had all observed the positive impact of his approach to law enforcement. Sergeant Patricia Johnson, who had been Morrison's field training officer, delivered remarks that captured the transformation in how he was viewed by the department. "Officer Morrison came to us as someone we weren't sure would fit into modern policing," she said. "But he showed us that the best police officers are those who combine strength with service, who project authority while treating everyone with dignity and respect. She gestured toward Morrison, who was standing with his academy classmates. His military background didn't make him unsuitable for police work. It made him exactly the kind of officer our community needs. Someone who understands that real strength comes from protecting others, not intimidating them. As Morrison began his patrol duties and started building relationships within the community he served, he reflected on the lessons he had learned during his academy training. The young recruits he had initially seen as unprepared had proven themselves capable of extraordinary performance when provided with proper leadership and confidence. The modern approaches to policing that he had questioned had value when combined with timeless principles of leadership and public service. His role hadn't been to impose military methods on civilian policing, but to show how military virtues like discipline, courage, and service could enhance rather than conflict with community-oriented law enforcement. Most importantly, Morrison had learned that experience and authority had value regardless of age or background, but only when they were applied in ways that empowered others rather than simply demonstrating superiority. His intervention during the training exercise hadn't been about showing his competence. It had been about helping young officers discover their own potential for excellence. The 3 words that had changed everything, "Police your ranks," had been more than just a command. They had been a reminder that order comes from within, that discipline is a foundation for service, and that real leadership means helping others find their strength rather than simply displaying your own. The recruits who had called him a relic learned that day that some principles transcend generational differences and institutional boundaries. They discovered that respect is earned through performance rather than demanded through position, and that the best leaders are those who create other leaders rather than simply solving problems themselves. Morrison's legacy at the police academy wasn't written in policy changes or curriculum modifications, but in the improved performance of officers who had learned to combine modern policing techniques with timeless principles of leadership and public service. He had shown them that authority and compassion weren't contradictory, that strength and service went hand in hand, and that the most effective approach to any challenge was the one that brought out the best in everyone involved. Sometimes wisdom comes disguised as obsolescence, and sometimes the person everyone dismisses as outdated is exactly the person who holds the keys to success. Morrison had looked like someone whose time had passed, but when the moment demanded real leadership, he had proven that true professionalism never becomes irrelevant. The young officers who had seen him as a relic learned that experience is a force multiplier that can't be replicated through training or technology, and that the most modern approach to leadership is often the one that draws on timeless principles proven effective through decades of practical application in the most demanding circumstances. This story was brought to you by the Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever witnessed someone whose age or background made them seem out of place until a moment of crisis revealed their true capabilities? Have you seen someone transform from being dismissed as irrelevant to being recognized as indispensable through a single demonstration of competence and character? Tell us in the comments about the times when someone surprised you by proving that experience and wisdom never go out of style. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, if you believe that we should value proven leadership regardless of where it comes from or how old-fashioned it might appear, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one, where we'll continue to share the stories of extraordinary people who remind us that true authority comes from character and competence, and that sometimes the most important lessons come from those who have earned the right to teach them through decades of service to others.